My dear friends, let me tell you about a woman who taught me that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to say no. Her name was Margaret Whitaker, though everyone called her Maggie. And at 63, she discovered that elderly wisdom sometimes comes wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Picture this: a small wooden church nestled in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, where the wind carries whispers of sagebrush and the promise of early snow. The pews are filled with weathered faces, calloused hands, and hearts heavy with loss. They've gathered to remember Thomas Whitaker, a man who spent 40 years turning raw prairie into a thriving 2,400-acre ranch. But this isn't really a story about Thomas. It's about the woman sitting in the front row, her fingers unconsciously tracing a small silver compass pendant that catches the autumn light streaming through those church windows. Maggie had worn that compass every day for 33 years, a gift from Thomas on her 30th birthday, back when they were still dreaming about what their life together might become. "Money is just a tool, Maggie," he'd told her that day, fastened the chain around her neck. "You're my compass." Now, as Pastor Reed's gentle voice filled the church with stories of Thomas's generosity, how he'd never foreclosed on a neighbor, how he kept the irrigation water flowing even during the worst droughts, Maggie felt that compass growing warm against her chest. She had no idea that in just a few hours, those words would become her lifeline in a storm she never saw coming. You see, friends, Maggie had spent 4 decades as more than just a rancher's wife. She was the one who balanced the books, managed the accounts, and kept meticulous records of every dollar that flowed through Whitaker Wind and Water, LLC. While Thomas worked the land, Maggie worked the numbers, turning their modest operation into a $52 million empire that included not just a ranch, but controlling interest in a renewable energy company and water rights that stretched across 3 counties. But here's what makes this story so remarkable, and why I knew I had to share it with you today. Because sometimes family inheritance isn't just about money. Sometimes it's about the values we pass down, the boundaries we set, and the courage to protect what truly matters, even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. As the last of them faded and neighbors began filing out to share casseroles and coffee in the church basement, Maggie had no idea that her son Brandon was already making phone calls. She didn't know that her daughter-in-law Savannah was drafting legal documents. She couldn't have imagined that the reading of Thomas's will, scheduled for the very next morning, would turn her quiet grief into a battle for everything she held dear. But Thomas knew. Somehow, in those final months when Maggie thought he was just being sentimental, asking her to promise she'd keep the water flowing, and remember what really matters, he was actually preparing her for the fight of her life. The compass pendant fell heavier as she walked toward her old pickup truck, past a cluster of modern SUVs that looked so out of place in the church parking lot. She paused at Thomas's favorite spot, a weathered bench overlooking the valley where you could see their ranch house nestled among the cottonwoods 12 miles away. "I don't know what you got me into, old man," she whispered to the wind, "but I promise you this. Whatever storm is coming, I won't lose my way." She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be, because in less than 24 hours, Maggie Whitaker would discover that sometimes the people who claim to love us most are the ones willing to take away our freedom to prove their point. She would learn that boundaries in life aren't just polite suggestions. They're the difference between standing firm and being swept away. But most importantly, she would discover that true strength doesn't come from holding on to things. It comes from knowing which things are worth fighting for and which battles are won not by conquering others, but by refusing to lose yourself in the process. The wind picked up as she drove home that evening, rattling the windows of the pickup and sending dried leaves skittering across the ranch road. Maggie pulled her coat tighter and touched the compass one more time, feeling its familiar weight against her chest. Tomorrow, she would learn the true meaning of that gift. Tomorrow, she would discover that sometimes love requires us to break hearts in order to save souls. And tomorrow, the quiet ranch wife who had spent 4 decades in the background would step into the spotlight of her own life and show the world what resilience really looks like. But tonight, as she pulled into the circular drive and saw the warm lights of home waiting for her, Maggie Whitaker was still just a widow missing her husband, unaware that she was about to become something much more powerful. A woman who knew exactly where she stood and exactly how much it would cost her to stay there. The conference room at Hanson and Associates had witnessed plenty of family drama over the years, but even veteran attorney Jim Hanson seemed uncomfortable as he shuffled through the thick stack of papers that would change everything. Maggie sat quietly in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, still wearing her simple black dress from the funeral, that silver compass catching the morning light streaming through the windows. Brandon paced by the bookshelf, his expensive suit and Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with the restless energy of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. At 35, he'd built a successful real estate empire on the East Coast, specializing in high-end developments that transformed rural communities into luxury destinations. His wife Savannah sat perfectly poised beside him, her manicured fingers already taking notes on her tablet, sharp eyes missing nothing. Before we begin, Jim cleared his throat, I need to remind everyone that Thomas Whitaker was of sound mind when he executed this will just 6 months ago. I have documentation from 2 physicians confirming his mental capacity, and the document was witnessed by 3 impartial parties. Maggie's hand instinctively moved to her compass. 6 months ago, Thomas had insisted on that trip to town, claiming he needed to update some paperwork. She thought it was just his meticulous nature, the same attention to detail that had built their empire from nothing. The estate is valued at approximately $52 million, Jim continued, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room. This includes a 2,400-acre ranch, 3 commercial wind turbines, extensive water rights, and a 68% controlling interest in Whitaker Wind and Water LLC. Brandon stopped pacing. Savannah's fingers stilled on her tablet. The room fell silent except for the tick of an antique clock on the mantel. And the beneficiary of this estate is... Jim paused, looking directly at Maggie. Margaret Rose Whitaker, to whom all assets transfer immediately upon Thomas's death. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Maggie felt the world tilt slightly, as if she were looking at everything from a different angle. $52 million. She'd balanced the books for 40 years, but somehow hearing it said out loud made it seem impossible, overwhelming. What about Brandon? Savannah's voice cut through the quiet, sharp as a blade. What about his inheritance? Jim consulted his papers again. Thomas left a letter explaining his decision. He writes, and I quote, Brandon and Savannah have been well provided for throughout their adult lives. They have received education funds, business loans, and startup capital totaling over $300,000. They have built their own success and no longer require financial support from the ranch. The land and business must remain with someone who understands its true value to the community. Brandon's face had gone pale, then flush red. That's impossible. Dad, promise me. We've talked about developing the waterfront property, about expanding the renewable energy division. This ranch has been in the Whitaker family for generations. Actually, Jim said carefully, your father purchased this land in 1985. And according to his letter, those development conversations are precisely why he changed his will. Maggie remembered those conversations now, fragment of arguments she'd tried to stay out of. Brandon pushing for modernization and growth opportunities. Thomas growing quieter and more stubborn, talking about water rights and community responsibility in ways that seemed to frustrate their son. This is insane. Savannah stood up, her professional composure cracking. Maggie has never run a business. She's a bookkeeper, not a CEO. She doesn't understand the potential this company has for expansion, for real growth. But Maggie was remembering other things now. Late nights when Thomas would sit at their kitchen table, poring over reports about drought patterns and aquifer levels. His insistence that they maintain relationships with every local farmer, every small rancher who depended on their water access agreements. His fury when Brandon had casually mentioned that nobody would miss a few small-time operations if it meant bringing in real money. There's more, Jim continued. Thomas established several trusts and provisions. Brandon, you're named as a trustee for a community scholarship fund, with access to income from that trust if you choose to participate in its management. Savannah, you're invited to serve on the advisory board for the renewable energy expansion, with appropriate compensation for your expertise. Advisory board? Brandon's voice was dangerous now. I was supposed to inherit this company. I was supposed to take over operations. Your father felt, Jim said diplomatically, that your vision for the company's future differed significantly from his own. Maggie finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. What exactly did Thomas want me to do with all this? Jim smiled for the first time that morning. He said you'd ask that question. His instructions were simple. Keep the water flowing. Trust your compass. Remember that wealth is what you build, not what you spend. The compass seemed to pulse against Maggie's chest. She could almost hear Thomas's voice in those words, could picture him sitting across from her at their breakfast table, drinking coffee and talking about their neighbors like they were family. Because to Thomas, they had been family, the network of small ranchers and farmers who had helped them build something bigger than themselves. Brandon moved to stand directly in front of his mother, his shadow falling across her chair. Mom, you need to understand something. This is bigger than you realize. Savannah and I have investors interested in this property. We've got plans for sustainable development that could triple the value of this estate. Sustainable development, Maggie repeated slowly, finally understanding what had been bothering Thomas in those final months. Is that what you call it when you sell water rights to build golf courses? The look that passed between Brandon and Savannah told her everything she needed to know. Her son hadn't just been making plans. He'd been making promises to people with very deep pockets and very different ideas about what the land was worth. We need to continue this conversation at home, Savannah said smoothly, already gathering her things. Maggie, why don't you stay in the guest suite tonight? We have a lot to discuss about the transition of management, about bringing in professional help to handle assets this complex. But Maggie was touching her compass again, feeling its steady weight, remembering Thomas's voice that last night. Money is just a tool, Maggie. Character is a compass. And for the first time since walking into that conference room, she felt something shift inside her chest, not grief, not confusion, but something that felt surprisingly like relief. Because suddenly, she understood exactly what Thomas had been trying to tell her, and exactly why he'd chosen to trust her with everything they'd built together. The real inheritance wasn't the money, it was the responsibility, and the choice of what to do with both. The drive from the lawyer's office to Brandon's downtown apartment felt like traveling between two different worlds. Maggie's old pickup truck seemed out of place among the sleek sedans and luxury SUVs in the underground parking garage, just like she felt out of place in the glass elevator that whisked them up to the 15th floor. Brandon's apartment was everything the ranch house wasn't. All sharp angles and cold surfaces, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that had grown around the old farming community, like a glossy shell. The furniture looked expensive and uncomfortable, the kind of pieces you admired but never really lived in. Even the flowers were artificial, perfect silk hydrangeas that would never need water, never wilt. Never remind you that real beauty requires care and attention. Sit down, Mom, Brandon said, gesturing toward a granite-topped dining table that could have seated 12 but felt strangely empty. We need to talk. Savannah was already moving through the kitchen with efficient precision, making coffee none of them really wanted, her heels clicking against the marble floors like a countdown timer. She'd changed out of her funeral outfit into a sharp business suit that made her look like she was heading to a boardroom instead of having a family conversation. This is going to be a lot to manage, she said, setting down 3 matching cups that looked like they'd never been used. $52 million isn't the kind of money you can just wing it with, Maggie. You need professional management, investment strategies, tax planning. Your father and I managed just fine for 40 years, Maggie said quietly, wrapping her hands around the warm cup and thinking about the mismatched mugs in her own kitchen, each one chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Managing a ranch operation and managing this level of wealth are completely different things, Brandon said, pulling out a chair across from her. Dad was brilliant at what he did, but he was old school. He never really understood the potential of what he'd built. Maggie looked around the apartment again, at the expensive art that looked like it had been chosen by a decorator rather than loved by its owners, at the pristine surfaces that showed no signs of actually being lived in. And you think you understand better? I know I do. Brandon leaned forward, and for a moment she could see the earnest little boy he'd once been, the one who used to follow Thomas around the ranch asking a million questions about everything. Mom, I've got connections with investment groups who specialize in sustainable development. They're talking about a $50 million resort complex on the waterfront property, complete with renewable energy infrastructure and water conservation technology. We could triple the value of the estate while still honoring Dad's environmental values. By selling our water rights to build a golf course, Maggie said flatly. Savannah sat down beside her husband, her expression carefully neutral. It's more complex than that. The resort would actually use less water per acre than traditional agriculture, and the revenue would allow us to invest in water conservation projects across the region. It's a win-win for everyone. But Maggie was thinking about the Anderson farm, 3 miles downstream from their property. 5 generations of Andersons had worked that land, and old Pete Anderson still came by every month to discuss water allocation with Thomas. She was thinking about the Martinez family, who ran organic vegetables on the south boundary, and the seasonal workers who'd been coming to their ranch for 20 years because Thomas paid fair wages and treated them like human beings. What happens to the people who depend on that water now? She asked. Brandon waved his hand dismissively. They'll adapt. That's how business works, Mom. You can't let sentiment override smart decision-making. Sentiment. Maggie repeated the word slowly, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. Is that what you call caring about your neighbors? I call it being realistic about market forces, Savannah said smoothly. The agricultural economy in this region is dying anyway. We'd actually be doing everyone a favor by bringing in tourism revenue and service jobs. Maggie stood up abruptly, moving to a wall of windows that looked out over the valley. She could see the ranch from here, a tiny cluster of buildings in the distance, surrounded by the patchwork of green that represented dozens of family operations. Inspirational stories often started, she realized, with moments like this, when someone had to choose between what was easy and what was right. Your father spent 40 years building relationships with those people, she said without turning around. He kept the Anderson farm running during the drought of '08. He gave the Martinez family a loan when their equipment broke down, never asked for collateral. He hired local crews, even when he could have gotten cheaper labor from outside the county. And that's admirable, Brandon said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made her spine stiffen. But it's not sustainable long-term business practice. You can't run a $50 million company on handshake deals and small-town sentiment. Maggie turned to face her son, really seeing him for perhaps the first time in years. When had he become this person who talked about their neighbors like they were obstacles to profit? When had he started measuring success only in dollars instead of the healing after betrayal that came from being part of a community that took care of each other? What exactly are you asking me to do? She said. Brandon and Savannah exchanged a look, and then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. We've had our attorneys prepare a durable power of attorney. It would give us a legal authority to manage the estate on your behalf while you adjust to everything. The papers landed on the granite table with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the sterile apartment. Maggie stared at them without moving, feeling her heart start to pound against her ribs. It's completely standard in situations like this, Savannah said quickly. You'd still be the owner, but we'd handle all the business decisions, the investments, the legal complexities. You could go back to the ranch and just live. No stress, no pressure, no worries about making the wrong choice with this much money. We've already talked to some excellent care facilities, Brandon added. Nothing institutional, of course. There's a beautiful senior community about an hour from here, very upscale, all the amenities you could want. You'd have your own apartment, but there would be people to help with anything you need. The compass pen and felt like it was burning against Maggie's chest. Care facilities, senior communities. They weren't just asking her to sign over her legal rights. They were asking her to sign over her life, to disappear quietly while they dismantled everything Thomas had spent 40 years building. And if I don't sign, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Brandon cleared his throat. Mom, you're not equipped to handle this kind of responsibility. If you try to manage this alone and make the wrong decisions, well, we'd have to explore other legal options, competency evaluations, conservatorship proceedings. It would be messy and public and painful for everyone. We don't want to come to that, Savannah added, her voice soft with false sympathy. We're family. We should be able to work this out together. But Maggie was remembering something Thomas had said during one of his more lucid moments near the end, when the cancer medication was making him drowsy, but his mind was still sharp. Brandon's forgotten where he comes from. He'd whispered, "Don't let him forget where he's going." She looked at the papers again, at the neat legal language that would make her a stranger in her own life. She thought about the ranch house where she'd been happy for 40 years, about the office where she'd balanced the books and made the quiet decisions that kept everything running. She thought about Pete Anderson and the Martinez family, and all the other people who trusted the Whitaker name to mean something more than profit margins. And then she thought about boundaries in life, not as walls to keep people out, but as shorelines that kept you from washing away completely. "No," she said. Brandon blinked. "What?" "No." Maggie's voice was stronger now, carrying a certainty that surprised even her. "I won't sign your papers." "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. You're still grieving. You're overwhelmed." "I'm thinking perfectly clearly." Maggie moved to the window again, looking out at the ranch that was now legally, completely, undeniably hers. "Your father trusted me with this responsibility. I'm going to honor that trust." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. When Brandon spoke again, his voice was cold and final. "Then I'm sorry, but you're no longer welcome here. The lease on this apartment is through one of our LLCs. If you won't accept our help, then you'll need to find somewhere else to stay." Savannah's expression didn't change, but she pulled out her phone and began typing. "I'll have the locks changed within the hour. Your things will be packed and available for pickup tomorrow." Maggie looked at her son, this stranger who had somehow grown from the little boy who used to help her feed the chickens, and felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, exactly, but something smaller and more specific. The illusion that love was always gentle, that family meant safety, that doing the right thing would be rewarded instead of punished. But alongside that breaking, she felt something else growing stronger. Resilience, maybe, or just a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing exactly where you stood, even when the ground beneath you was shifting. "All right, then," she said, reaching for her purse. "I guess I know where I'm going." She walked to the door without looking back, but she could feel their eyes on her, could sense their shock that she'd actually chosen the ranch over their version of security. As she waited for the elevator, she touched the compass pendant one more time and smiled. Thomas had been right. Money was just a tool. But now, finally, she was learning to use it properly. The 12-mile drive from town to the ranch had never felt so long or so necessary. Maggie's old pickup truck rumbled along the dirt road, kicking up dust clouds that looked like smoke signals in the rearview mirror, a message to anyone watching that she was coming home to stay. The afternoon sun was already slanting low across the prairie, painting everything gold and amber, and for the first time since Thomas's funeral, she felt like she could actually breathe. The ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwoods that Thomas had planted the first year they were married, back when the land was mostly sagebrush and wishful thinking. Now those trees towered overhead, their leaves rustling with secrets and memories, their roots deep enough to find water even in the driest years. The house itself wasn't much to look at from the outside, a simple two-story structure with a wraparound porch and shutters that needed painting. But it had been home for 40 years, and it welcomed her back like an old friend. Elias Romero was waiting on the porch steps, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. At 58, he'd been the ranch foreman for 15 years, ever since Thomas had promoted him from seasonal worker to full partner in everything that mattered. He was the kind of man who could read the sky like a book and fix anything that could be broken. But more importantly, he was the kind of friend who showed up when you needed him most without being asked. "Thought you might be coming home," he said simply, standing up as she parked the truck. "Got the heat turned back on and put some groceries in the kitchen. Coffee's fresh if you want some." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes, the first real tears she'd shed since the funeral. Not because she was sad, but because she'd forgotten what it felt like to be welcomed instead of tolerated, to be treated like a person instead of a problem to be managed. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than any two words she'd ever spoken. They sat together on the porch as the sun finished setting, not talking much, just watching the wind turbines turn lazily in the distance and listening to familiar sounds of home. Cattle lowing in the far pasture, the creak of the old windmill by the barn, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves that sounded almost like conversation if you listened carefully enough. Brandon came by yesterday, Elias said finally, before the funeral. Asked a lot of questions about water rights and property boundaries. Seemed real interested in the south pasture, where the creek runs. Maggie nodded. The south pasture was the most valuable piece of property on the ranch, not just for its grazing, but for its water access. Control those rights, and you control the lifeline of half a dozen smaller operations downstream. He mentioned any specific plans? She asked. Nothing concrete, but he had someone with him. City fellow in an expensive suit, kept talking about development potential and highest and best use. They spent a lot of time looking at maps. The pieces were starting to come together in Maggie's mind, forming a picture she didn't like, but wasn't surprised by. Brandon hadn't just been making casual conversation about expansion over the years. He'd been laying groundwork, building relationships, preparing for the day when he'd inherit everything and could implement his vision of progress. Except now he couldn't. And from the tone of his voice in that sterile apartment, she was beginning to understand that he had no intention of accepting that limitation gracefully. Elias, she said carefully, what do you know about durable power of attorney? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening horizon. No, it's something people use when they want to make decisions for someone else. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not so much. He looked at her directly. You thinking about signing something like that? Brandon wants me to. Says I'm not equipped to handle the business side of things. Elias snorted. You've been handling the business side of things since before I started working here. Who does he think balanced the books all these years? Who negotiated the contracts with the energy company? Who figured out how to structure the water sharing agreements? So everyone got what they needed. It was true, and hearing it said out loud made Maggie realize how much she let herself be diminished in her own story. She'd spent so many years being Thomas's wife and Brandon's mother that she'd almost forgotten she was also the woman who'd helped build a $52 million empire from scratch. He thinks I should move to a senior community, she said. Let them handle everything while what did he call it? Just live without stress or pressure. Might be nice, Elias said with a straight face. No more worrying about drought or cattle prices, or whether the Martinez family can afford their water allocation this year. No more staying up late during calving season, or getting calls at 3 a.m. because a pump broke down. Just shuffle around in a bathrobe and play bingo. Despite everything, Maggie found herself laughing. When you put it that way, it does sound appealing. Sure it does. Of course, you'd also miss out on watching the sunrise over mountains every morning. Wouldn't get to see the baby calves learning to walk. Wouldn't be here when old Pete Anderson drives over to talk about his irrigation schedule and ends up staying for dinner because he's lonely since his wife passed. The laughter died in Maggie's throat because that was exactly what she'd be missing. Not just the business of running the ranch, but the life of it, the connections that made all the hard work worthwhile, the sense of being part of something bigger than herself. There's something else, Elias said quietly. Got a call this afternoon from Dr. Noelle Hart. You remember her. Used to work for the state pension fund before she went independent. She's a financial advisor now, specializes in helping people manage significant inheritances. Maggie nodded. She'd met Dr. Hart at a few community events over the years, had always been impressed by her no-nonsense approach to complex problems. She heard about Thomas passing, wanted to offer her services if you need help sorting through everything. Says she's worked with families before where there were complications about inheritance. The word complications hung in the air between them like a storm cloud. Maggie had a feeling that Dr. Hart knew exactly what kind of complications they might be facing. She available to meet tomorrow? Maggie asked. She's available tonight, if you want. Says these kinds of situations have a way of moving fast once they get started. As if summoned by their conversation, headlights appeared at the end of the ranch road, moving slowly toward the house. 2 vehicles, a sensible sedan followed by an older truck that looked like it belonged in the county instead of the city. The sedan stopped first, and Dr. Noel Hart emerged like a force of nature despite her small stature. She was the kind of woman who wore practical shoes and carried a briefcase that looked like it had seen real use, the kind of professional who'd earned her reputation by getting results instead of just looking impressive. The second truck belonged to Judge Miriam Cole, retired but still carrying the quiet authority that had made her one of the most respected jurists in the state. At 72, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. "Maggie," Dr. Hart said, climbing the porch steps with her briefcase in hand. "I'm sorry for your loss, and I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. But Elias thought you might need some perspective on your situation." Judge Cole settled into one of the porch rockers like she'd been invited for Sunday dinner. "Sometimes," she said in her courtroom voice, "the best defense is understanding exactly what you're defending against." As they gathered around the old kitchen table where Thomas had made so many important decisions over the years, Maggie felt something shifting inside her chest. These weren't people who wanted to manage her life or make her decisions for her. These were people who understood that sometimes emotional wisdom meant knowing when to ask for help, and life lessons were often learned best in the company of others who'd walked similar paths. Dr. Hart opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Let's start with what you actually inherited," she said, "because I have a feeling Brandon's version of your financial situation might not match reality." And as the kitchen filled with the rustle of papers and the quiet conversation of people who understood that money was just a tool, but land was a legacy, Maggie touched her compass pendant and realized she wasn't alone in this fight after all. The kitchen table that had hosted 40 years of morning coffee and evening conversations had never seen a meeting quite like this one. Dr. Hart's papers were spread across the worn wooden surface, like a battle plan, each document telling a different part of the story that Thomas had left behind. Judge Cole had put on her reading glasses and was studying the financial statements with the same careful attention she'd once given to legal briefs, while Elias sat quietly in the corner, listening to everything and saying nothing, the way ranch foremen learned to do when the conversation was important. "The first thing you need to understand," Dr. Hart said, her finger tracing across a column of numbers, "is that you're not just wealthy, Maggie. You're strategically positioned. Thomas didn't just leave you money. He left you leverage." She pulled out a detailed property map, the kind surveyors used, with every boundary and water right marked in different colors. These water rights alone are worth more than most people make in a lifetime, but their real value isn't in what you could sell them for. It's in what happens to the entire region if they're sold to the wrong buyer. Maggie leaned forward, studying the complex web of lines and numbers. She'd seen versions of this map before, but never with this level of detail, never with the understanding that each colored line represented someone's livelihood. "The Anderson farm depends on water access from your South Creek," Dr. Hart continued. "So do the Martinez vegetables, the Brennan dairy operation, and about a dozen smaller ranchers. If those rights get sold to a resort development, all those operations become unsustainable within 5 years. Which would actually increase the value of the remaining water rights," Judge Cole observed dryly. "Eliminate the small users. Concentrate the resource. Charge premium prices to whoever can afford to pay them. It's economically brilliant and morally bankrupt." Elias finally spoke up from his corner. "It's also exactly what Brandon was discussing with that city fellow yesterday. They spent an hour at the fence line with the Anderson property, talking about eliminating redundant agricultural uses." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Redundant agricultural uses. That was how her sons saw their neighbors. Not as families who'd worked this land for generations, but as inefficient obstacles to profit maximization. "There's more," Dr. Hart said, pulling out another set of documents. "I've been doing some research into Brandon's business dealings on the East Coast. He's very good at what he does. I'll give him that. But his specialty is a particular kind of development that requires massive upfront capital and promises massive returns." She spread out printouts of news articles, business filings, and financial reports. 3 resort projects in the last 5 years, each one built on previously agricultural land. Each one requiring consolidation of water resources and the displacement of existing users. He's not just successful, he's built a reputation as someone who can make the impossible happen. And now he's made promises to investors based on inheriting this property. Judge Cole said. It wasn't a question. That would be my guess. Dr. Hart nodded. Which means he's not going to give up easily. In fact, I'd expect him to escalate pretty quickly once he realizes you're serious about maintaining independent control. The compass pendant felt heavy against Maggie's chest. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about family dynamics or hurt feelings. Brandon had built a professional reputation on his ability to deliver specific results to very wealthy people. Failing to gain control of the ranch wouldn't just disappoint him. It could destroy the business relationships that his entire career depended on. What kind of escalation? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Judge Cole leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. Competency challenges are becoming more common in inheritance disputes, especially when significant assets are involved. The process usually starts with concerns about decision-making capacity, moves to requests for medical evaluations, and can end with court-ordered conservatorship. He threatened something like that today, Maggie admitted. Said if I tried to manage everything alone and made the wrong decisions, he'd have to explore other legal options. Classic intimidation tactic, Dr. Hart said. Make the alternative seem so scary and complicated that signing over power of attorney looks like the reasonable choice. But here's what he's counting on you not knowing. You're in a much stronger position than he wants you to believe. She pulled out a fresh document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. Thomas was more thorough than you might realize. 6 months ago, he had comprehensive mental capacity evaluations done by 2 independent physicians. He also had the ranch's financial management systems audited by a CPA firm from Denver. Every decision, every contract, every financial transaction for the past 5 years has been documented and verified. Why would he do all that? Maggie asked. Because he saw this coming. Judge Cole said quietly. Thomas was many things, but he wasn't naive. He knew Brandon was making plans, and he wanted to make sure you'd have the tools to defend yourself if necessary. Elias stood up and moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the dark shapes of the outbuildings against the star-filled sky. There's something else, he said without turning around. Thomas asked me to keep records of every conversation I had with Brandon about the ranch. Said it might be important someday. He pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket, the kind ranchers use to track cattle movements and weather patterns. Got 3 years' worth of notes in here. Dates, times, witnesses when there were any, including yesterday's conversation about eliminating redundant agricultural uses. Dr. Hart's eyes lit up. That's exactly the kind of documentation that courts love to see. It shows a pattern of planning and preparation, not the erratic decision-making of someone with diminished capacity. So what's our strategy? Maggie asked, feeling more confident than she had since walking out of Brandon's apartment. Our strategy, Judge Cole said with emphasis on the word "our," is to make it clear that any legal challenge will be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. We document everything. We maintain transparent business operations, and we build a support network that demonstrates your competency and community involvement. I can help with the financial management systems. Dr. Hart offered not to take over, but to make sure everything is properly documented and professionally managed. We'll create such a clear paper trail that even the most aggressive attorney would think twice about challenging your capacity. And I can provide legal consultation if needed, Judge Cole added. I may be retired, but I still have friends in the courthouse. More importantly, I've seen enough competency challenges to know how to structure your affairs to make them nearly impossible to contest. Maggie looked around the table at these women. Inspirational stories were made, she realized, not by people who never faced challenges, but by people who face them with the right kind of help. Dr. Hart with her financial expertise, Judge Cole with her legal knowledge, Elias with his practical wisdom and documentation. They weren't just offering professional services. They were offering something much more valuable. They were offering to stand with her. There's one more thing we should discuss, Dr. Hart said carefully. Your relationship with Brandon going forward. Because this isn't just about business. It's about family. And sometimes the hardest part of setting boundaries in life is accepting that love doesn't always look the way we want it to. The words hit deeper than Maggie had expected, because underneath all the legal strategies and financial planning, underneath the questions of competency and water rights and development deals, was the simple, painful truth that her son had chosen money over relationship. He'd chosen control over trust. And she was going to have to find a way to live with that choice, even as she refused to enable it. I keep thinking about something Thomas used to say. She said, finally, you can't save people from the consequences of their choices. You can only make sure you don't become one of those consequences. Smart man. Judge Cole nodded. The question is, what does that look like in practice? How do you protect the ranch and the community without destroying whatever relationship might still be salvageable with Brandon? It was Elias who answered, still looking out the window, but speaking directly to the heart of the matter. You treat him like you'd treat any other person who was trying to take something that wasn't theirs. You stand your ground. You protect what needs protecting, and you leave the door open for him to change his mind. But you don't set yourself on fire to keep him warm. The kitchen fell quiet except for the tick of the old clock and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves. Maggie touched her compass pendant and realized that Thomas had been preparing her for this moment long before he'd change his will. All those conversations about community responsibility, about keeping the water flowing, about remembering what really matters, they hadn't been philosophical discussions. They'd been practical instructions for the battle she was about to fight. All right, she said, looking at each of them in turn. What do we do first? Dr. Hart was already reaching for her phone. First, we set up a meeting with your bank to review all accounts and establish clear documentation procedures. Then we contact the attorney who handled Thomas's will to make sure everything is properly filed and recorded. I'll make some calls about installing a security system, Elias added. Nothing dramatic, just cameras at the gates and main buildings. If things get contentious, we want a record of who comes and goes. And I'll prepare a brief outlining your legal position, Judge Cole said. Not for filing, just for reference if anyone starts making threats about competency challenges or conservatorship proceedings. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's diagnosis 2 years ago. Hope. Not the desperate kind that pretends problems don't exist, but the steady kind that comes from knowing you're not facing them alone. Thank you, she said as they prepared to leave. All of you. I don't know how to repay. You don't repay family, Dr. Hart interrupted gently. You just show up for each other when it matters. After they'd gone, Maggie sat alone at the kitchen table, looking at the scattered papers that represented 40 years of work and planning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of her resolve. But tonight, in the quiet of the house that had been home for so long, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Ready. The compass pendant caught the kitchen light as she finally stood to turn off the lamps and head upstairs. Thomas had been right about so many things, but especially about this. Money was just a tool. The real treasure was knowing who you could count on when everything else fell apart. And now, finally, she was beginning to understand that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Not because she could face this battle alone, but because she didn't have to. The first sign that trouble was brewing came 3 days later, delivered with a morning mail and a concerned expression from Patricia Brennan, whose dairy operation bordered the ranch's eastern fence line. Patricia had been stopping by with fresh eggs and local gossip for 15 years, but today she clutched her jacket against the November wind and wore the careful expression of someone carrying bad news. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, she began, settling into the kitchen chair that had become her usual spot during these visits. But Tom Richardson was at the Chamber of Commerce meeting yesterday, and he mentioned that Brandon's been asking questions about your situation. Maggie poured coffee into Patricia's favorite mug, the one with a faded rooster that had survived countless washings, and waited. Tom Richardson owned the farm implement dealership in town and had a reputation for knowing everyone's business, usually before they knew it themselves. What kind of questions? Maggie asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. About whether you'd been struggling lately, memory problems, confusion about finances, that sort of thing. He was asking it like he was concerned, you understand, but Tom said it felt more like fishing than worrying. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in Maggie's mouth. She'd been expecting legal challenges and business pressure. But somehow the idea of Brandon spreading whispers about her mental capacity felt more personal, more cruel than anything they'd discussed in that sterile apartment. "Patricia," she said carefully, "have I seemed confused to you lately? During any of our conversations about water allocation or maintenance schedules or feed prices?" Patricia snorted. "Honey, you've been sharper than most people half your age since the day I met you. Last month, you caught an error in my calculations that my own accountant missed. If you're losing your mind, I'd like to have whatever you're losing it to." But the damage was being done, and they both knew it. In a small community where reputation mattered more than money, and trust was a currency that kept everything running smoothly, questions about someone's mental capacity spread faster than wildfire and were twice as hard to put out. The phone started ringing that afternoon. First, it was Dr. Martinez from the family practice, calling to check in and asking if she'd been feeling overwhelmed lately, if she was sleeping well, if she needed any help managing her medications. Then it was the president of the local bank, wondering if she'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss wealth management strategies for seniors. By evening, even Pastor Reed had stopped by, ostensibly to bring a casserole from the church auxiliary, but actually to observe her demeanor and ask gentle questions about how she was adjusting to her new circumstances. "This is orchestrated," Dr. Hart said when Maggie called to report the day's events. "Someone is systematically planting seeds of doubt about your competency. It's actually quite sophisticated. They're not making direct accusations, just raising concerns that sound reasonable on the surface." "How do I fight something like that?" Maggie asked. "How do I prove I'm not confused without seeming defensive?" "You don't fight it directly." Judge Cole's voice came through the speakerphone. She'd apparently been with Dr. Hart when the call came through. "You make it irrelevant by demonstrating competency through actions, not words. Business as usual, but more visible, more documented, more obviously professional." That was easier said than done. The next morning brought a delegation from the county extension office, ostensibly there to discuss drought preparation strategies, but clearly fishing for signs of confusion or poor judgment. Maggie handled the meeting perfectly, discussing water conservation techniques and soil management strategies with the same expertise she'd shown for decades, but she could see them exchanging glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The real test came that afternoon when Pete Anderson drove over in his battered pickup truck, hat in his hands and worry lines creasing his weathered face. At 78, Pete had been farming the land adjacent to the South Creek for 50 years, and his operation depended on the water sharing agreement that Thomas had established decades ago. "Maggie," he said, settling onto the porch steps, because Pete Anderson was the kind of man who felt more comfortable outside than in parlors. "I've been hearing things around town that have me concerned." Here it was, she realized, the moment when she'd find out whether her neighbors trusted her judgment or believed the whispers that were circulating about her capacity. "What kind of things, Pete?" "Well, there's talk that you might be overwhelmed by everything Thomas left you, that maybe you're not up to managing the business side of things, the water rights and such." He twisted his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable. "And there's talk that maybe Brandon might need to step in, help you make some decisions about the property." Maggie felt her heart sink. If Pete Anderson, one of Thomas's oldest friends and most trusted neighbors, was starting to doubt her competency, then Brandon's campaign was working better than she'd feared. "Pete," she said carefully, "do you think I'm not capable of managing my own affairs?" He looked up at her then, really looked, and she saw something shift in his expression. "Hell no," he said flatly. "You've been running the numbers on this ranch since before my youngest was born. You're the one who figured out how to restructure our water agreement when the drought hit in '08. You're the one who warned us about that bad batch of feed from the co-op last spring. Then why are you concerned?" Pete's face darkened. "Because I heard Brandon was asking questions about our water sharing agreement. Specifically, whether there were any legal challenges to it, whether it might need to be modernized for current market conditions." He stood up, suddenly looking everyone at 78 years. "Maggie, that agreement is the only thing standing between my farm and bankruptcy. If someone decides it's not legally sound..." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Brandon wasn't just spreading rumors about her mental capacity for general purposes. He was laying the groundwork to challenge specific agreements and contracts, using her supposed confusion as justification for correcting arrangements that stood in the way of his development plans. "Pete," she said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "That water agreement was drafted by the best agricultural attorney in the state and has been reviewed and updated 3 times in the past decade. It's as legally sound as anything gets. I know that, and you know that, but if someone starts making noise about your mental state, about whether you understood what you were signing..." Pete trailed off, but they both knew how that sentence ended. That evening, Maggie sat in Thomas's old office, surrounded by filing cabinets full of contracts and agreements and correspondence that documented 40 years of careful, competent business management. Every water-sharing agreement, every lease, every service contract had been negotiated fairly and documented thoroughly. But all of that careful work could be undermined by whispers and doubts and the suggestion that she wasn't capable of understanding her own decisions. The phone rang, interrupting her brooding. Dr. Hart's voice was crisp and professional, but underneath Maggie could hear barely controlled anger. "I've been making some calls," she said without preamble. "Brandon's been busy. He's contacted 3 different law firms about competency challenges, and he's hired a private investigator to document your concerning behaviors." "What concerning behaviors?" Maggie asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "Driving alone to remote areas of the ranch. Having unexplained visitors at unusual hours. That would be our evening meetings, by the way. Making impulsive financial decisions without consulting family members. Showing signs of paranoia by installing security cameras. Every innocent action, twisted and reframed to look like evidence of decline." Maggie felt sick. "There's more," Dr. Hart continued. "He scheduled you for a comprehensive medical evaluation with a geriatric psychiatrist in Denver. The appointment is for next Tuesday. You should be receiving official notification in tomorrow's mail. Can he do that? Can he force me to see a doctor? Not yet. But if you refuse, he'll use as evidence of lack of insight into your own condition. It's a classic catch-22. Comply and risk having your words twisted, refuse and be labeled uncooperative." Maggie closed her eyes and touched her compass pendant, feeling its familiar weight against her chest. Healing after betrayal, she was learning, didn't come from forgiveness or understanding. Sometimes it came from simply refusing to let the betrayal destroy what was worth protecting. "Dr. Hart," she said, opening her eyes and looking at the wall of photographs that showed 40 years of community events, successful harvests, and neighbors helping neighbors, "I think it's time to stop playing defense." "What do you have in mind?" Maggie stood up, suddenly energized by a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. "I think it's time to remind this community who I am and what I've built here. And I think it's time to show Brandon that if he wants to fight, he's going to get one, just not the kind he's expecting. Because sometimes," she was realizing, "the most powerful response to people questioning your strength wasn't to prove them wrong. It was to show them they'd been asking the wrong question entirely." Dawn was breaking over the Bighorn Mountains when Brandon's rented SUV appeared at the ranch gates, followed closely by a Savannah sedan and a third vehicle that Maggie didn't recognize. She watched from the kitchen window as they parked near the barn, their city clothes looking as out of place against the ranch backdrop as their intentions felt in her heart. She'd been expecting this confrontation ever since Dr. Hart's warning about the medical evaluation. Brandon wasn't the type to wait patiently for legal proceedings when direct intimidation might work faster. But Maggie was ready for him in ways she hadn't been a week ago. The kitchen table was set like a boardroom, with neat stacks of documents arranged in precise order. Dr. Hart sat to her right, briefcase open, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed financial statements. Judge Cole occupied the chair across from the door, her silver hair pulled back in the same stern style she'd worn on the bench, radiating quiet authority. Elias stood by the window, Maggie's informal recorder, his small notebook ready to document whatever was about to unfold. The knock on the door came at exactly 8 o'clock, punctual, professional, and somehow more ominous than if they'd simply barged in. "Come in," Maggie called, her voice steadier than she felt. Brandon entered first, wearing his most expensive suit and the expression he probably used for difficult negotiations. Savannah followed, tablet in hand, every inch the successful businesswoman. The third person was a stranger, a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses who had the look of someone accustomed to asking uncomfortable questions. "Mom," Brandon said, taking in the assembled group with obvious surprise. "We need to talk." "Then talk," Maggie replied, gesturing to the empty chairs. "But understand that anything said here will be witnessed and documented." The thin man stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Dr. Richard Pemberton. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, and I've been asked to conduct a preliminary assessment of your mental capacity and decision-making ability." "By whom?" Judge Cole asked sharply. "By concerned family members who have observed behaviors that suggest possible cognitive decline," Dr. Pemberton replied smoothly. Dr. Hart looked up from her papers. "Do you have a court order for this evaluation, doctor?" "Not at this time, but—" "Then this is a voluntary consultation, which Mrs. Whitaker is free to decline." Judge Cole interrupted. "Please take a seat, doctor, and let's discuss what specific behaviors have raised these concerns." The tension in the room ratcheted up several degrees as everyone settled into chairs around the table. Maggie found herself thinking about all the family dinners that had taken place in this kitchen, all the birthday celebrations and holiday gatherings when this table had been a place of warmth and connection. Now it felt like a battlefield. "Brandon," she said quietly, before Dr. Pemberton asked his questions, "I'd like to ask you one. Why are you doing this?" Her son's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and desperate underneath the professional facade. "Because I love you, Mom. Because Dad left you with more than you can handle, and I'm watching you make decisions that could destroy everything he worked for." "What decisions?" Dr. Hart asked, pen poised over her notepad. "What specific choices has Mrs. Whitaker made that concern you?" "She's refused professional management of a $52 million estate," Savannah said, jumping in smoothly. "She's been having secretive meetings at unusual hours. She's installed security cameras without consulting anyone. She's showing signs of paranoia and social isolation." "Let's address those one by one," Judge Cole said. "Dr. Hart, what's your professional assessment of Mrs. Whitaker's financial management decisions?" Dr. Hart opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "In the 2 weeks since Mrs. Whitaker inherited this estate, she has maintained all existing operations without interruption, paid all employees on schedule, met every financial obligation, and improved the documentation systems for both the ranch and the business operations. She spread out bank statements and operational reports across the table. Cash flow is positive, debt service is current, and all regulatory compliance requirements are being met. I see no evidence of financial mismanagement or poor decision-making." Dr. Pemberton leaned forward, studying the documents. "But surely the complexity of managing assets of this magnitude would be overwhelming for someone without extensive business experience?" "Mrs. Whitaker has been managing these assets for 40 years. Elias spoke up from his position by the window. "She's the one who negotiated the original wind energy contracts. She's the one who structured the water sharing agreements. She's the one who built the relationships with every financial institution and service provider this operation depends on." He opened his small notebook and read from it in his steady, matter-of-fact voice. "September 15th, 2023. Brandon Whitaker discussed selling water rights to eliminate redundant agricultural uses. October 3rd, 2023. Brandon Whitaker suggested converting South Pasture to highest and best use development. November 2nd, 2024. Brandon Whitaker told associate that local farming operations were inefficient obstacles to progress." The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon's face had gone pale, and Savannah was typing furiously on her tablet, probably trying to figure out how to spin what they'd just heard. "Those are private conversations taken out of context," Brandon said finally. "Are they?" Maggie asked, her voice soft but carrying a steel edge that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "Because they sound exactly like the conversations your father was worried about. They sound exactly like the reason he changed his will." She reached into the stack of papers in front of her and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "Thomas's private notes from his final months. Your father kept a record too, Brandon. Would you like me to read what he wrote about your development plans?" The compass pendant seemed to pulse against her chest as she opened the journal to a page marked with a pressed wildflower, one of Thomas's quiet romantic gestures that had always made her smile. March 20th, 2024, she read aloud. Brandon doesn't understand that the water isn't ours to sell. It belongs to the community, to the families who built their lives around it. He sees inefficiency where I see neighbors. He sees missed opportunities where I see promises that must be kept. She looked up at her son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Your father didn't leave everything to me because he thought you were incompetent, Brandon. He left it to me because he knew exactly how competent you are. He was afraid of what you'd do with that competence. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitaker, regardless of family dynamics, there are still concerns about your ability to manage complex decisions under stress. Perhaps we could discuss some specific scenarios. Judge Cole interrupted. Before we go any further, I think you should know that Mrs. Whitaker's mental capacity was evaluated by 2 independent physicians just 6 months ago at her husband's request. Both evaluations concluded that she showed no signs of cognitive decline and was fully capable of managing her own affairs. She pulled out official-looking documents with medical letterhead. I also think you should know that this entire conversation is being recorded with the consent of all parties present and will be available for review by any court that might be asked to consider competency questions. The room fell silent, except for the tick of the old kitchen clock and the whisper wind through the cottonwood leaves outside. Dr. Pemberton was studying the medical evaluations with obvious concern, probably realizing that his preliminary assessment was looking more like participation in a harassment campaign. But it was Brandon who finally broke the silence. His voice smaller than Maggie had heard it since he was a child. Mom, I need you to understand something. I've made commitments. There are people counting on me to deliver on this development project. And there was, finally, the truth underneath all the legal maneuvering and psychiatric evaluations and concerns about her mental capacity. Brandon had promised other people's money that he could deliver something he didn't own, and now he was desperate enough to try to take it by force. What kind of commitments? She asked, though she was afraid she already knew. Investment partnerships. Development loans. I've put my own company up as collateral for the preliminary financing. His mask of professional confidence was completely gone now, replaced by the raw fear of a man who'd gambled everything on a single bet. If this deal falls through, I lose everything. Savannah was staring at her husband with an expression of dawning horror, probably just realizing how much he'd risked without telling her. Dr. Pemberton was quietly packing his briefcase, clearly wanting to distance himself from what was looking less like a medical consultation and more like a family crisis with serious legal implications. But Maggie felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not anger, not triumph, but something that felt surprisingly like compassion. Because this was still her son, still the little boy who used to help her feed the chickens and dream about making the ranch bigger and better. He'd just forgotten that bigger and better weren't always the same thing. Brandon, she said quietly, sit down. He collapsed into the chair across from her, looking older than his 35 years. Savannah moved to stand behind him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. And for the first time since this whole conflict began, Maggie caught a glimpse of the woman who'd fallen in love with her son instead of the calculating businesswoman who'd been trying to manage his inheritance. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, Maggie said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had been building in her over the past 2 weeks. And then I'm going to tell you what you can do about it. She looked around the table at the faces watching her. Dr. Hart and Judge Cole, who'd become her chosen family. Elias, who'd stood by her from the beginning. Even Dr. Pemberton, who was getting an education in what real emotional wisdom looked like. And Brandon and Savannah, who were about to learn that mother-son conflict didn't always end the way they expected. First, she said, I'm establishing the Whitaker Trades and Scholarships Fund with $10 million from the state. It will provide training grants for young people who want to learn welding, hydraulic engineering, renewable energy technology, all the skills this community needs to thrive. Brandon started to speak, but she held up a hand. Second, I'm creating a community water trust that will ensure the irrigation rights for this property can never be sold to private developers. The water will always be available for agricultural use at fair prices, managed by a board that includes representatives from every family operation in the watershed. The compass pendant felt warm against her chest as she continued. Third, I'm maintaining full operational control of Whitaker Wind and Water, LLC, with professional advisory support from Dr. Hart and legal oversight from Judge Cole. The business will continue exactly as your father intended, profitably, sustainably, and with the community's interests as our primary concern. The kitchen was so quiet she could hear the wind turbines turning in the distance, still generating clean energy, still spinning out the legacy Thomas had built. Now, she said, looking directly at her son, here's what you can do about it. You can find a way to honor your business commitments without destroying this community. You can spend 200 hours volunteering with the Scholarship Fund, learning what it really means to build something instead of just developing it. And when you've done that, we can talk about finding ways for you to be part of this operation. As a participant, not as an owner. She paused, letting the words settle. Or you can continue trying to force me out of my own life, in which case you'll discover that fighting your mother in her own kitchen, surrounded by people who've known her for 40 years, is a losing proposition. Brandon stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with the realization that the quiet ranch wife he'd been trying to manage was actually the strong woman who'd helped build everything he'd been trying to take. 200 hours, he said finally. 200 hours. Learning to weld, or helping with irrigation maintenance, or teaching kids how wind turbines work. Your choice. And after that, Maggie smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. After that, we'll see if you remember who you used to be before you forgot where you came from. As the meeting broke up and people began gathering their papers, Maggie remained seated at the kitchen table, touching her compass pendant and thinking about boundaries in life. Not as walls keep people out, but as shorelines that prevented everything valuable from washing away. The storm had passed, but more importantly, she discovered she was strong enough to weather it. And sometimes that was the most inspirational story of all. Not the one about never falling down, but the one about learning to stand back up. 6 months later, Maggie stood on the same porch where she'd faced down her son's ultimatum, watching the sunrise paint the Bighorn Mountains in shades of gold and rose. The cottonwood trees were budding with new life, and the sound of water running through the irrigation channels carried the promise of another growing season. But the most beautiful sound of all was coming from the workshop behind the barn, where Brandon was teaching a group of teenagers how to maintain wind turbine components. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. Those first few weeks after the kitchen confrontation, Brandon had approached his volunteer hours with the grim determination of someone serving a sentence. He'd shown up precisely on time, completed exactly what was asked of him, and left without conversation. But somewhere around hour 50, when he'd been helping old Pete Anderson repair an irrigation pump that had been installed before Brandon was born, something had shifted. You know, Pete had said, wiping grease from his hands while Brandon held a flashlight, "Your dad and I installed this pump together in '89. He was about your age, maybe a little younger, stubborn as hell about doing it right, even though the cheap way would have been easier." Brandon had been quiet for a long moment, staring at the machinery that had been faithfully serving the community for over 3 decades. What made him choose the hard way? Same thing that made him change his will, I reckon, Pete had replied. He understood the difference between building something and just making money. That conversation had marked a turning point. Brandon started asking questions instead of just following instructions. He began staying after his required hours were finished, curious about systems he'd never bothered to understand when his focus had been on replacing them. Most importantly, he started listening to the stories about drought years when Thomas had kept the water flowing despite personal cost, about equipment failures that had brought the community together to find solutions, about the countless small decisions that had built trust over decades. Now, as Maggie watched him demonstrate proper torque specifications to a group that included the Martinez family's youngest daughter and 2 Anderson grandchildren, she could see glimpses of the little boy who used to shadow Thomas around the ranch, asking endless questions about how everything worked. "He's good with them," Dr. Hart observed, joining Maggie on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the monthly financial reports that had become their regular Friday morning routine. "He always was good with people when he wasn't trying to manage them." Maggie replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Thomas used to say Brandon's problem wasn't lack of ability. It was too much ambition for the wrong things. The numbers in Dr. Hart's reports told their own story of transformation. The Whitaker Trades and Scholarships Fund had already graduated its first class of renewable energy technicians, 3 of whom had been hired by regional power companies at wages that kept them in the local community. The Community Water Trust was serving 12 family operations, ensuring stable agricultural use while generating enough revenue to maintain and improve the infrastructure. Most surprisingly, Whitaker Wind and Water, LLC was posting its best profit margins in 5 years, not because they'd expanded aggressively, but because they focused on operational excellence and community partnerships. Savannah called yesterday. Dr. Hart mentioned casually, but Maggie caught the significance immediately. About the East Coast properties? The refinancing came through. They managed to restructure their debt without losing the development company. But it was close. Another month, and they would have lost everything. Maggie nodded, feeling a complex mix of relief and sadness. She was glad Brandon's business would survive, but the knowledge of how close he'd come to risking everything, including his integrity, for the promise of quick wealth was sobering. She also mentioned something else. Dr. Hart continued. They're thinking about relocating. Not immediately, but maybe in a year or 2. Apparently, Brandon's been talking about getting back to real development, affordable housing, sustainable communities, projects that actually improve people's lives instead of just generating maximum returns. The workshop door opened, and Brandon emerged with a small group of students, all of them talking animatedly about gear ratios and maintenance schedules. Maggie watched as he knelt down to help the youngest student, Pete Anderson's 8-year-old grandson, understand how the turbine blades captured wind energy. "Grandma Maggie," the boy called out, spotting her on the porch. "Mr. Brandon says I can help design a small windmill for our school science project." "Does he now?" Maggie smiled, walking down to join the group. "And what did you learn about wind energy today?" "That it's not just about the wind," the boy said seriously. "It's about understanding how all the parts work together and how you have to take care of them so they'll take care of you." Over the child's head, Maggie met Brandon's eyes and saw something there she hadn't seen in years. Genuine pride in work that mattered, satisfaction that came from building instead of just acquiring. As the students scattered to their various homes and weekend adventures, Brandon lingered, helping to put away tools with the careful attention Thomas had always insisted on. "Everything in its place," he said quietly, echoing his father's old refrain. "He'd be proud of you," Maggie said, meaning it. Brandon paused in his cleaning, looking out toward the mountains where Thomas's ashes had been scattered according to his wishes. "I don't know about that. I put everyone through hell for my own mistakes. And then you did the work to fix them. That's what matters." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the easy rhythm of people who understood each other and the task at hand. It reminded Maggie of the old days, when Brandon had been her eager helper rather than her adversary. "Mom," he said finally, "I owe you an apology, not just for the legal threats or the competency challenge, but for not seeing who you really are, for treating you like someone who needed to be managed instead of someone who'd been successfully managing things all along." Maggie set down the wrench she'd been holding and really looked at her son. The expensive suits had been replaced by work clothes. The calculating expression had been replaced by something more open, more vulnerable. He looked more like the young man she remembered, the one who'd left for college full of dreams about making the world better, before he'd gotten confused about what better actually meant. "You don't need to apologize for being ambitious," she said finally. "You need to apologize for forgetting that real success is measured by what you build, not what you take." Brandon nodded, and she could see him struggling with words that didn't come easily to someone who'd spent years learning to negotiate and manipulate instead of simply being honest. "I want to do better," he said, "not just with the volunteer work, but with everything, with how I treat people, how I make decisions, how I define success. I want to be someone Dad would have been proud of." "Then keep showing up," Maggie said simply. "Keep doing the work. Keep listening to people instead of trying to manage them. Keep remembering that boundaries in life aren't about keeping people out. They're about creating space for everyone to grow." As they walked back toward the house, Maggie's hand instinctively went to her compass pendant. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow facing the loss of everything she held dear. Now she was something she'd never expected to become, a leader, a protector, a woman who'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love was teaching people the difference between what they wanted and what they needed. The kitchen table where they'd faced off in that tense confrontation was now covered with scholarship applications and community project proposals. Judge Cole had become a regular Friday evening visitor, helping review legal documents and sharing stories about other families who navigated similar challenges. Dr. Hart's monthly financial reviews had evolved into strategic planning sessions that included input from everyone affected by their decisions. But most importantly, the kitchen had become a place of healing, not just for Maggie and Brandon, but for a community that had discovered what was possible when people chose cooperation over competition, when they measured wealth by what they shared rather than what they accumulated. "There's something I want to show you," Maggie said, leading Brandon to Thomas's old office. She opened the desk drawer and pulled out a small wrap package, something she'd been saving for the right moment. Brandon unwrapped it carefully, revealing a silver compass identical to the one Maggie wore around her neck. "Dad gave me this on my 30th birthday," she explained. "He said money was just a tool, but love was a compass. I think it's time you had your own." Brandon held the compass up to the light, streaming through the office windows, watching the needle settle on true north. "I don't know if I deserve this yet. None of us deserve the gifts we're given," Maggie said, thinking about the ranch, the community, the second chance she'd been offered to define her own life. "We just have to prove ourselves worthy of them through our choices." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the clear Wyoming sky, 3 generations of the community gathered in the ranch yard for the monthly scholarship fund barbecue. Pete Anderson was there with his grandchildren, teaching them how to identify different types of clouds. The Martinez family had brought homemade salsa and stories about their daughter's acceptance to the renewable energy program. Dr. Hart was deep in conversation with several high school students about career opportunities in sustainable agriculture. Judge Cole was holding court near the grill, sharing legal wisdom disguised as cooking tips, while Pastor Reed led a group discussion about the difference between progress and improvement. Elias moved to the crowd like the quiet backbone he'd always been, making sure everyone had enough to eat and felt welcome. And Brandon, her son who'd almost lost his way but found it again, was sitting on the porch steps with Savannah, their heads bent over blueprints for a housing development that would provide affordable homes without destroying the agricultural character of the community. They were arguing about solar panel placement and water conservation systems, but it was the kind of argument that built things instead of tearing them down. Maggie stood in the doorway, watching the scene with the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she'd made the right choices, even when they'd been the hardest ones. This was what elderly wisdom looked like. Not the absence of conflict, but the knowledge of how to transform it into something constructive. "Beautiful evening," Judge Cole said, joining her in the doorway. "Beautiful life," Maggie corrected, touching her compass pendant one final time. The inspirational stories that mattered most, she'd learned, weren't about people who never faced challenges. They were about people who faced them with grace, who understood that healing after betrayal didn't mean forgetting the pain, but refusing to let it poison everything that came after. They were about people who built resilience not by avoiding storms, but by learning to dance in the rain. As the evening wound down and neighbors began gathering their children and their covered dishes, Brandon approached his mother with an expression she hadn't seen since he was young, shy, hopeful, a little nervous. "Mom," he said, "Savannah and I have been talking about moving back. Not to the ranch," he added quickly, "but to the area, maybe buying some land nearby, building something sustainable and community-focused, being part of what Dad started instead of trying to replace it." Maggie smiled, feeling the compass pendant warm against her chest. "Your father always said the land had a way of calling people home when they were ready to hear it. Would that be okay with you? Us being neighbors instead of strangers?" The question hung in the evening air like the scent of sagebrush and possibility. 6 months ago, Maggie might have answered with caution, with conditions, with the careful boundaries of someone who'd been hurt and wasn't sure she could risk being hurt again. But 6 months ago, she'd been a different person. Someone who confused keeping the peace with keeping herself small. Someone who thought love meant never saying no even when yes was destroying everything that mattered. Now she was a woman who understood that the deepest life lessons often came wrapped in the most difficult packages, and that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was a chance to become who they were meant to be, even if the journey was painful for everyone involved. It would be more than okay, she said, meaning every word. It would be perfect. As the last car pulled away and the ranch settled into the peaceful quiet of a spring evening, Maggie walked out to the edge of the porch and looked up at the stars that had watched over this land for countless generations. The wind carried a familiar sound to home, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the old windmill, the whisper of water moving through irrigation channels that would keep flowing long after she was gone. The compass pendant caught the starlight one final time, and Maggie smiled. Thomas had been right about so many things, but especially about this. Money was just a tool. Relationships were just a beginning. But character was a compass that kept you pointed toward true north no matter how fierce the storms or how many times you lost your way. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that really mattered. Not the $52 million or the 2,400 acres or the controlling interest in a renewable energy company, but the knowledge of how to use all those tools to build something worth leaving behind. The mother-son conflict that had almost destroyed their family had become the foundation for something stronger. The boundaries she'd learned to set had created space for everyone to grow, and the courage she'd found to fight for what mattered had shown a whole community what was possible when people chose love over fear, even when love required them to stand their ground. As she turned to go inside, Maggie heard the distant sound of wind chimes from the porch, their gentle music carrying across the prairie like a lullaby. Thomas would have smiled to hear them, she thought. He'd always loved the sound of home, calling its children back where they belonged. And finally, after 6 months of storms and struggles and the slow, patient work of healing, everyone was exactly where they needed to be. Epilogue, full circle. 1 year later. The carved wooden bench overlooking the valley had been Pete Anderson's idea, but the whole community had contributed to making it happen. In memory of Thomas Whitaker, he kept the water flowing, was etched into the backrest, along with a small compass rose that pointed toward the cluster of buildings that made up the ranch headquarters. Maggie sat on that bench now, watching her granddaughter, Brandon and Savannah's 6-month-old daughter, sleep peacefully in her arms while the annual harvest festival spread out across the meadow below. The scholarship fund had grown to serve 3 counties. The water trust was being studied by agricultural communities across the West, and Whitaker Wind and Water LLC had become a model for community-centered renewable energy development. But the real measure of success wasn't the numbers or the recognition. It was in the laughter of children learning to appreciate the land that sustained them, in the satisfied exhaustion of neighbors who'd worked together to bring in another good harvest, in the quiet confidence of community that knew it could weather whatever storms might come. Brandon emerged from the crowd below, climbing the hill with the easy stride of someone who'd finally learned the difference between rushing and moving with purpose. His housing development was breaking ground next month. 36 homes designed to complement rather than replace the agricultural landscape, complete with community gardens and shared renewable energy systems. She's beautiful, Maggie said as he settled beside her on the bench, looking down at the sleeping baby who carried Thomas's eyes and Maggie's stubborn chin. She's perfect, Brandon agreed. Savannah's convinced she's going to be an engineer. She already shows more interest in the wind turbines than in her toys. They sat in comfortable silence, 3 generations of the Whitaker family, watching over the land that had shaped them all. In the distance, the mountain stood eternal and unchanging, but the valley below was alive with the constant, beautiful work of people building something together. Dad would have loved this, Brandon said finally. He did love it, Maggie corrected gently. That's why he made sure it would continue. The compass pendant rested quietly against her chest, no longer a symbol of uncertainty, but of the unshakable knowledge that some things were worth whatever it cost to protect them. Resilience, she'd learned, wasn't about avoiding pain, but about transforming it into something that could nourish growth. Healing after betrayal wasn't about forgetting the wounds, but about refusing to let them define the future. And love, real love, the kind that lasted, wasn't about making people comfortable. It was about helping them become the people they were meant to be, even when the process was difficult for everyone involved. As the sun began to set behind the Bighorn Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Maggie touched her compass pennant one last time and smiled. The needle had found true north at last, and it was pointing exactly where it should. Toward home, toward family, toward the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and a legacy worth leaving. The inspirational stories that mattered most, she discovered, weren't about people who never faced challenges or made mistakes. They were about people who learned from both, who found the courage to set boundaries when necessary and tear them down when appropriate, who understood that elderly wisdom wasn't about having all the answers, but about knowing which questions were worth asking. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very persistent and very willing to risk everything for what you believed in, those stories had endings that felt like new beginnings, complete with sleeping babies and healing families, and the promise of water flowing clear and strong for generations yet to come. The compass had brought her home at last. And home, she'd learned, wasn't just a place or a collection of buildings, or even a piece of land that stretched as far as the eye could see. Home was the people who showed up when it mattered. Home was the work that connected you to something larger than yourself. Home was the courage to fight for what you loved, and the wisdom to know when the fighting was done. Home was exactly where she'd always been. She just finally learned to recognize it.